coopération.
Thank you, everyone, for your cooperation.
Usually addressed to the chair. Conformément à l'article 108.3 du règlement, le comité reprend.
Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3, we are resuming our consideration of Arrive Can 1.
To highlight. You've all been sent, we've received correspondence from Mr. Paul Girard and his doctor. His condition makes him unable to attend at this time, and based, in my opinion, on the information provided, it'd be best to discharge the summons to allow the individual to focus on his physical health. In fact, I took it upon myself as chair to inform him of this last Friday. Could I seek consent of the committee to discharge this summons so it is not active or hanging over him? Yes. Very good. That is done. Thank you. Additionally, I'd like to assure members that per the motion adopted on Tuesday, they can expect a subcommittee report presented at each public committee meeting, full committee, which precedes a subcommittee meeting. I will note for the record as well that this actually will be the first time that the committee has requested this type of reporting in this Parliament, and I'm happy to work with the subcommittee to oblige and report back to the full committee. Members will notice that I have added some business after this meeting. This is optional. We can deal with most of this or all of this on Tuesday. And I would like to deal with one issue which involves the release of documents. Puis Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés, c'est une question qu'elle a pour...
Madame Sinclair-Gagné has a question for us about that.
Once we're done with our witnesses today, if we proceed to business, I will make a commitment to members that if we deal with that and then we want to adjourn, that I will vote to adjourn that meeting. So this is my commitment to you that there'll be this won't turn into a lengthy meeting, because any other business that we have, we can deal with Tuesday. Now, you might still want to wrap it up, and that's fine. That's, of course, your decision. But I am committing. All I have is my word is my bond to you. My vote will be to adjourn that meeting should members want to adjourn without any other discussion if we're able to deal with the document question. And further, if we find we get into a long, lengthy discussion and members want to end the discussion, I will also vote to end the discussion. If we can wrap it up quickly, we will, and if we can't, we will end it. So my commitment to you is not to keep everyone here all afternoon. It is to try to resolve it quickly. So I'm telegraphing up front how I will vote on these two both. Not allow additional business unless the committee wishes it, and not to allow the debate to go on for hours and hours or for any lengthy period of time. So you can mull that over. I'd like now to welcome our witness as an individual, John Osowski, Managing Director. And sir, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate it. And you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and then we'll turn to our questions. So over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will begin by taking issue with repeated references to me having lied, fibbed, or being demonstrably dishonest. I corrected my testimony last October, and I apologized for not remembering all those who attended a Teams meeting from 3 years ago. Mr. Chair, not remembering is not lying. What more does the committee want from me? On Tuesday, May 14th, it was further implied that as a result of my casual employment status with the CBSA that I was gaining some improper business advantage. The sole purpose of this arrangement is to facilitate my access to my emails, calendar, and get the support required to prepare for a committee appearance. Let me be clear, no business advantage has been sought or received as a result of this arrangement, and I have always followed all conflict of interest requirements of myself. I would now like to remind the committee of the exceptional circumstances we found ourselves in during the spring of 2020. We were shutting down the largest unprotected border in the world while trying to ensure that critical supply chains remained functional for the essential trade of food, medicine, personal protective equipment, etc. We had repatriation flights for Canadians returning home and had to manage a myriad of issues with the United States. Coordinating all of this with our U.S. counterparts and supporting the government in this historic time was my priority. ArriveCan helped us administer the pandemic border measures, and I relied upon my officials to deal with the procurement details. With respect to the Auditor General's report, the agency has accepted the findings and put measures in place to ensure this type of situation doesn't happen again. As has been stated by the Auditor General, the rules were in place, but unfortunately it appears they were not always followed. I would now like to offer the following important context. Excuse me. We were asked by the Public Health Agency to develop the app to replace a paper process so they could get critical health information and pass that along to provinces in a timely manner. This was not planned for in any way. Certainly at the beginning, there was no budget, there was no project plan, or any of the other things we would normally have in place for the development of a tool like this. It was about responding as quickly as possible. And no one could have predicted at that time the dozens of versions that would be required to support the orders in council. Excuse me. Mr. Chair, mobile app expertise is a relatively new field for the government, and while the agency had some nascent capability, it was not sufficient, especially as the app changed frequently and became increasingly complex. While the Auditor General stated very clearly that at the outset getting outside support was reasonable, the value for money assessment appears to be partially based on the expectation that we should have hired public servants at less cost to do this work. I find this expectation downplays some important facts. First of all, these skills are in high demand, and the committee has heard that there is roughly a 30% vacancy in IT positions in the government, so I'm not sure we could have run a successful staffing process. Second, it takes months to hire somebody. Finally, with respect to funding, I would remind the committee that the agency absorbed a significant portion of these expenses and that there was no ongoing funding. While make-or-buy decisions are made by managers, hiring public servants with an ongoing source of funds is not considered a prudent management practice. To be clear, as the end of the pandemic was starting to come into sight and border volumes were increasing, what we needed was more border service officers, not app developers. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We're going to begin our first round. Mr. Barrett, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Mr. Sosky, you were the president of the Canada Border Service Agency, is that correct? And how are you employed now?
I work with PricewaterhouseCoopers.
And what's your position with PricewaterhouseCoopers?
My classification is a managing director, but I'm a senior strategic advisor.
And as a senior strategic advisor, are you aware of how much business your firm does with the Government of Canada?
Yes.
And how much business is that?
I don't have those numbers with me today.
Okay. Would you care to offer an estimation of how much business it is?
That's corporate information that I'm not privy to share.
You're not privy
to
share?
Well, I'm privy to, but I'm not in a position to share. That's something for the firm to respond to that question.
So the value of contracts between your firm and the Government of Canada is not something that you're prepared to share with us?
That's not my information to share. That's
okay.
The firm's
so,
information.
Sorry, I think it's germane, but we're going to circle back to it. We know that PricewaterhouseCoopers does significant business with the Government of Canada and formerly did business with the agency that you were the head of, the CBSA. You talked about taking a casual employment with the CBSA so that you could access information while you were concurrently working in a senior strategic advisory role for PricewaterhouseCoopers, a firm that does significant business with the Government of Canada, an amount so great and so sensitive you're not even prepared to disclose it to the committee today. Did you have any restraints put on you on the information that you were able to access when you were employed by the current president of the CBSA in preparation for your testimony before a parliamentary committee?
The letter of offer that was offered to me and I signed had conflict of interest provisions in it. I have access to my email on my calendar and other documents associated with events in the emails in the calendar.
So to be clear, the events,
if I may finish,
the events
and I recused myself from all work with CBSA while at public work, PwC.
Yeah, we've seen the record of the CBSA under your leadership on conflicts of interest. We heard testimony from CBSA officials about boozy dinners with contractors that were working for the CBSA. So you'll have to excuse me if I don't put great stock in in the seriousness with which you viewed the conflict of interest requirements that you said you would follow. You said that you had access to any documents related to items in your calendar and email. Well, as the president of the CBSA, I'd imagine that would be pretty significant. And working for a firm that hired the former head of the CBSA, having previously done business with the CBSA, and doing excess of tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in business with the Government of Canada, it seems that there would be a commercial advantage to having their senior advisor, an executive with this firm, to have access to all of their information from their calendar, emails, and associated documents when you were given that employment by Ms. O'Gorman. What date were you given access to the CBSA?
I don't recall the specific date. It was sometime in January initially to prepare for my January 18th, and then it was restarted again in February.
Can you please furnish this committee with the assigned offer of employment?
I believe that's in the possession of the agency. I don't have a copy of myself.
You don't have a copy of any of the employment documents, so you took a job with the CBSA and didn't keep a copy?
I'll look for it, but I think you're better off to get that from the agency. They would have a record of that.
Well, if you have it, I would be best to get it from you because we've asked for it from you.
I will look for it, and if I have it, I will certainly provide it.
Thank you. You still have 2 minutes. Pardon me, I was acknowledging the witness. You have 2 minutes.
Thanks very much. You were paid for your casual employment to access the documents in preparation for your testimony. That's correct?
I was asked to submit hours for my preparation, and I submitted 1 day.
And how much were you paid?
It was roughly $500.
So you were paid $500 to get access to internal files and documents, which I think I've already articulated is a highly questionable decision, and certainly raises ethical questions when based on your current employment and based on your employer's interest in the commercially sensitive information at the CBSA. Do you have a list of all of the documents, or are you still in possession of the documents that you retrieved in preparation for your committee appearance?
Mr. Chair, the one document that I was actually provided with, besides looking at my emails and calendars, was the ATIP that was provided to OGO, which is several hundred pages long, and I did not even look at it. I know that you asked Ms. O'Gorman for the forensics of what I've touched when I'm in there, and I'll leave it up to them to provide that information to you. I think you'll find it fairly underwhelming.
Well, I find it very interesting because the president of the CBSA said that you had access to any of the documents that you would have had access to as president of the CBSA.
While that may be the case, I did not access anything or take any advantage that would put me in any conflict of interest.
Yeah, I can't take it at face value, the seriousness with which you've approached the conflict of interest document that you signed, knowing the casual relationship with avoidance of a conflict of interest that your department had under your leadership. I mean, what better way for a big consulting firm to drum up new business with the CBSA when they've been cutting big checks with very little accountability than to have their former president, now employee, being able to get access to all of the documents that he had while working as the head of that agency.
Mr. Chair, I feel compelled to respond to this.
I'll allow it. Go ahead, yes.
Thank you. Given all that's gone on for this ArriveCAN discussion over the last couple of years, do you really believe that I would further put myself into jeopardy by pursuing something that had some conflict of interest?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll take that question as rhetorical. Thank you. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Osowski, for coming in as a witness today. Did you want to add anything more to your statement that you just said?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay. What role did you play in the development and oversight of the ArriveCAN app during your tenure as the president of the CBSA?
Obviously, as the president, I was running the agency during the pandemic. We had a request to develop the app from the Public Health Agency because of the paper process that was in place at the time. asked my officials to look into it. They came up with the idea, and they went ahead and procured the necessary resources to deploy it.
And what role did you play in terms of oversight of the ArriveCan app?
Certainly, as the accounting officer at the time, I was responsible for making sure that there was a system of controls in place. Those obviously are delegated down into the organization, and the specific responsibility was given to the CFO. But there's standard operating procedures. There was training before delegations were provided. There was managers' individual responsibilities to validate the work that was happening with their employees. And then there was sample audits and invoice checks that were done as part of the regular financial management process.
Did you have any involvement in the procurement process, specifically when it came to selecting contractors?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was not involved in any aspect of the vendor selection process or any aspects of the contracts whatsoever.
What role does the president of the CBSA generally play in the agency's procurement process?
Generally, I would only be involved in a procurement process if it required a Treasury Board submission or something that required a minister's approval.
Could you please explain to us why it was necessary for you to be rehired for the one day on a casual basis in order to prepare for your committee appearance?
Well, you can actually check my my emails on this, but I did not want necessarily to be paid for this. I simply wanted access to my computer emails and calendars so that I could prepare for the committee. As the committee is aware, relying on my memory in the first instance when I came to committee didn't work too well for me. So getting some facts and some clarity of my records was important for subsequent testimonies.
So, do you know why they offered you this one-day contract of $500?
In order for someone to have access to the government account and check for their information, they need to be on strength. So I was offered a position so that I could access my emails and calendar.
And does this one-day contract also cover any expenses?
No.
Were there any expenses incurred in that one day?
Just personal expenses.
And this was in order to prepare for your appearance at the OGO committee on January 18th of this year?
Yes. Just to clarify, when I say personal expenses, that my personal well-being because of the time I spent preparing, but there was no expenses submitted to the agency.
So no personal or work expenses?
No.
And what you mentioned something about emails you were looking for to support your appearance?
Yes.
Could you provide some more detail on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've gone to committee on 3 separate occasions before now, and as the committee's inquiries have progressed, they've asked for very precise, detailed information, and so it behooved me to be prepared for these types of questions, and in order to do that, I needed access to my emails to refresh my memory and make sure the committee was getting the most accurate information possible to continue their deliberations.
And in an earlier answer to your responsibilities as president of the CBSA, you mentioned that you also oversee sample audits.
No, I'd said that the agency would perform sample audits of invoices as part of the financial management process, and I think the CFO testified to that to you a couple of weeks ago in terms of the sampling that they did on invoices around ArriveCan.
Why were you not rehired for your previous committee appearance on October 24th, 2023 and in 2022?
That's a good question. I probably, in retrospect, should have sought that support from the agency to prepare for those appearances.
So you mentioned support from the agency.
I mean,
elaborate a little bit more?
Access to my emails and just to get a correct record of events for the committee's use.
during your time as president of the CBSA, do you recall the agency providing support to past or current employees to aid their preparation for appearances at parliamentary committees?
I don't recall specifically, but it's not an uncommon practice, as Ms. O'Gorman pointed out the other day.
Chair, how much time do I have?
You're at 0, so if you have a quick question, I'll allow it, but you are spot on at that.
Okay, I'm just going to leave it then.
Thank you very much. I
Mr.
appreciate it.
Osowski?
Thank you. Thank you. Maintenant, c'est Madame Sinclair.
Madame Sinclair Desgagnés, 6 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Osowski, you are the managing director of your. Do you know many clients that you would pay $500 to so that they could look at their old email? I don't know any. So why would the taxpayer have to pay that kind of money, $500, so you could look at your email? Is that normal to you?
My best explanation of that would be, as a government employee, I was required to submit hours to the agency. I submitted 1 day's worth of hours, and they chose to give me a paycheck. So you can probably best get the answer in terms of the rules around that from the agency.
Pourquoi n'avez-vous pas refusé le $500?
Why didn't you refuse the $500, knowing that you were already employed by PricewaterhouseCoopers? Why didn't you say no? Why did you accept this exchange of money? Was it to protect the reputation of the CBSA, or just to get something in exchange?
It was not to get anything in exchange. My initial response was that I did not want to get paid. They asked for my hours and they paid me. I'm happy to pay the money back.
Je pense que ce serait effectivement un bon début parce que effectivement.
Well, I think that would be a good start because why should the taxpayer pay for your preparation? You prepare for a committee knowing you will have to answer questions. According to the Globe and Mail, the Butler Agency gave to the CBSA, Mr. Hugh Dano more precisely, wrote about in September 2021 and April 2022. You were in position at that time. When did you first hear about Butler's complaints?
The first time that Butler made a complaint that I was aware of was during the committee proceedings, and after I left the agency in the fall of 2022. This was well-trodden ground at the Government Operations Committee. I received no allegations, to be clear, from Butler during my tenure as president.
Et ça vous semble normal que des plaintes.
Does that seem normal to you, that complaints that triggered an inquiry, an investigation by the RCMP? Do you think that it was normal that you were doing your work as the head of the CBSA, but you didn't know about this type of important complaint?
Well, as I mentioned, the complaint didn't happen during my tenure. Ms. O'Gorman received the first complaint of allegations in the fall of 2022. I had retired. If something had happened during my tenure, I would have investigated and done what was ever required.
Pourtant, c'est ça. On a.
Well, the information we have is that the first complaints were September 2021, but you were in position at that time. It seems to me very strange that you weren't aware of it. All of this happened, you say, after you left. We heard in Ogo that from Mr. McDonald's testimony that it was Mr. Dohan who had left your office for GC strategies. He was responsible for the choice of GC strategies, and they had been competitors. That's just a small added fact I'm giving you. So why did you not set aside Deloitte?
Well, maybe I'll just answer. You have two questions there. One is that Mr. Utano testified at committee that the email that he received from Butler in 2021 was around a pay issue, and they resolved it at his level. Nothing was brought to my attention. With respect to Mr. Dwan's testimony around the choice of GC strategies. He made it very clear that he was offered a choice between a technical managed service outsourcing option that Deloitte had put forward and then something else that apparently had no reference to GC strategies on it. So I would refer you back to Mr. Dwan's testimony.
Mais je vous pose la question, Monsieur.
Yes, Mr. Dwan left your office and he indicated that Deloitte had been set aside. So then, if you were president of the CBSA, why are there so few details about complaints? Whether it was Butler or a GC strategy, it seems to me that there is some sort of gap between the complaints from the suppliers and the important contract that wasn't competitive that was given to GC strategies for these persons who were working for your services. So, it seems to me that you must have been in the decision-making loop. So why don't you have the details?
Well, I'm not sure what your reference is to Mr. Dwan leaving my office, but I've stated at multiple occasions at other committee appearances that Mr. Dwan never corresponded with me or asked me for any advice on anything to do with the contracts or the options with this. And so the testimony is there. The departmental records have been provided. There's thousands of pages of ATIP the committees have access to. I was not involved in the vendor selection process, and nothing was brought to my attention about allegations of wrongdoing by Butler during my tenure.
Donc, seulement Monsieur.
So only Mr. Zutano, McDonald, and Duwan were involved in the selection of GC strategies. You were never informed about anything whatsoever with respect to GC strategies being selected for ArriveCan. Never. Madame Sinclair? Please go ahead, Mr. Osowski.
I was not involved in the vendor selection process. There's no record that I was involved in the vendor selection process. Mr. Dwan was offered a technical choice in terms of a managed service by Deloitte or a staff augmentation approach, and he's testified to that, and I believe you have all the documents around that. I was not involved in the vendor selection process in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you very much. Next up, suivant, it's Ms. Blaney. Nice to see you again. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and it's nice to have some time with you, Mr. Osowski. So I think the biggest challenge, of course, is that Canadians living through so much and then being in a time of inflation and of cost of living crisis, seeing all of these resources out the door has really made a huge impact on them. And I think of, a lot of money, like $60 million in profits, would have made a huge difference in multiple ridings across the country to help people alleviate food insecurity, for one example. So I guess my first question to you is, this committee has heard valuable testimony from an earlier meeting with the National President of Customs and Immigration Union that frontline officers were never consulted on the development of the app or any of its 70 updates. And this really concerns me, especially as someone who works closely with people out of the front line, because they often have the most effective solutions because they're the ones doing the work. And I know that my colleague, Blake Desjardins, has also brought up this issue with the now president, Ms. Erin Gorman. But since you were the decision maker during the development of that, can you tell us why it is that frontline border officers weren't consulted for this app development?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think it's important to remember that when these changes happened, they were as a result of public health orders or orders in council. And so there was a necessary confidentiality until they came into force, where it was usually a very short time period, often less than 24 hours. And so before any changes happened, while we would have sort of taken into account any feedback, excuse me, from the front line with respect to what was working or what wasn't and how to sort of make it more useful, we were not ever able to sort of disclose in advance what the upcoming changes was going to be, aside in that very short window to make sure that they were aware if a change in posture was required or some change in process was required.
Okay, so that's interesting to me. So it seems fascinating to me that there was no process in place. Like, I understand what you're saying about the confidentiality and all the requirements. But for me to look at the fact that there was 70 updates, it seems like there was no process during this time where you actually selected some frontline workers to help you be guided. And when you see the background of this app, it failed again and again, like it was all over the media. So I'm just wondering, is there no process internally that you had to actually work with frontline folks that deliver the service, that often are the ones who could give you the most effective information? And there was no strategizing internally about how to do that work in what I understand is a dire circumstance. But I would also say that during a dire circumstance, that's when you want to get it right the most. And it doesn't seem like that was in any way a priority.
Mr. Chair, I would say that we had regular meetings with the union. We were in constant contact with our frontline officers and the regions during the pandemic. Anything that wasn't working, we tried to take into account to make sure that the border process would be as smooth as possible. And I would remind you that, the officers themselves were vulnerable here. This was, especially in the very early days when little was known about how the disease was transmitted in paper processes. We were very concerned with the front line and the personal protective posture that they had as they did their duties to sort of ensure the flow of people that were entering back into the country. So we did our best to consult with them. But at the end of the day, there was very tight timelines, and because of necessary confidentiality around public health orders or orders in council, we weren't able always to do it as fulsome as we might have wanted to.
Okay, so we also heard from Mr. Weber, the president of the union, that the CBSA was short-staffed by about 2,000 to 3,000 workers prior to the beginning of the pandemic, which gave way for the need for an application in the first place, which I think tells you if you're not working on the ground when crisis strikes, then you really have a problem. So this is devastating to understand. So it gave way to the application in the first place, and that the funds allocated to the ArriveCan app could have hired like 500 officers instead. So I understand that we were in the middle of a pandemic, but I'm wondering if there's any reflection on what happened prior to the pandemic and how not having enough people trained and ready has created this crisis where we've seen a huge amount of taxpayer dollars go to someone out there who's walking away with a huge amount of profit when the app didn't even work. And we could have seen officers on the ground providing services, doing it safely if there was planning put into place. So I'm just wondering if there's any reflections on making sure that you maybe listen to the union, and when there's not enough people to do the job, that is rectified.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would say that we would hire as many border service officers as we could afford to do so. It's as simple as that. We were always trying to rebalance the workforce in terms of retirements, attrition, workload, changes in volumes. But to be clear, the purpose of the app was not to replace officers. The purpose of the app was to collect healthcare information from individuals so that it could be passed along to the provincial authorities and for the public health agency to use in understanding how the virus was circulating around the globe. So they're mutually exclusive in that regard.
Thank you very much. Beginning our second round, Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Current CBSA President O'Gorman and suspended or on medical leave Min Doan, a senior executive at CBSA, have been caught repeatedly lying to this committee and other committees. In fact, the RCMP are investigating currently Min Doan's allegations that he deleted purposely tens of thousands of emails over a 4-year period. Are you aware of that, sir?
I'm aware of what's been said at committee about this, but I have no other details.
Right. And did you ever engage in that type of activity when you had access to your own emails after leaving the agency? Did you delete some of your emails?
Mr. Chair, I've always honored whatever information management, document management principles that were imposed on me by the government. So no, I have not inappropriately deleted any emails.
Thank you. Any and all emails relating to your communications with Mindone or your communications with GC Strategies or anything in relation to the ArriveCan or Bottler AI would be preserved at the CBSA. Is that what you're saying, sir?
Mr. Chair, I've reviewed my emails and I have no evidence that anything has been changed or removed from what I remember.
Thank you. Now let's end this speculation once and for all. There's fairly clear evidence on the record at this committee and other committees that it was in fact Mindone who finally made the decision to select GC Strategies. Do you agree with that?
I would go back to Mr. Dewan's testimony, Mr. Chair, and he said
Mr.
he was
Dewan's-
offered a
Mr.
technical
Dewan's,
decision.
Sir, Mr. Dewan's testimony is rife with inconsistencies and outright lies. There is evidence from other witnesses, including written evidence, which clearly supports that there was one person who was in charge at the time at CBSA, and it was Mindone who held that position and who ultimately selected GC Strategies. I'm asking you, sir, do you agree with that or not?
I do not agree with that.
Fine. The RCMP, as I said, are investigating this and a number of other issues surrounding the CBSA and other agencies. Has the RCMP contacted you, sir? Have they requested any documentation from you?
Mr. Chair, no, they have not.
Will you cooperate with them when and if they decide to talk to you?
Mr. Chair, absolutely.
The president of the CBSA, Aaron O'Gorman, appeared 2 days ago and was quite clear that there was only one casual employee contract that was offered to you, and that was in relation to the one-day contract that we spoke about. But that's not accurate. That's not accurate at all. In fact, you've received more than one contract since you left the CBSA. Isn't that correct?
Mr. Chair, the initial contract that occurred was for my appearance on January 18th. After we closed out that contract, I was invited back to OGO in February, but it didn't work out for scheduling reasons. And so that contract was restarted. So under her, I believe what she said, under her tenure, it's only happened once, and maybe it was just referring to me once, but in fact, there was two separate contracts. And they're not, actually, I think I would just clarify, they're not contracts. I'm on casual employment status.
Did you, in fact, sign a contract in relation to your appearance today?
I signed a casual employment letter of offer.
Okay, and how much are you receiving?
Nothing.
Nothing. All right. Now, in relation to the documentation, you claim you only accessed your emails and your calendars. But again, that's not accurate because you had access literally to everything at the CBSA surrounding this scandal. Isn't that correct, sir?
I guess, Mr. Chair, notionally, I guess that would be the case. But
right.
You've asked the department for records of what I've accessed, and I
yes.
think you'll find it underwhelming.
Well, Ms. O'Gorman was asked the question 2 days ago, what documentation did you receive? She very curtly said, well, I don't know, you have to ask Mr. Osowski. So we're asking you, isn't it true that Ms. O'Gorman actually furnished you with a number of documents in relation to your committee's appearances, including the statement of allegations against Mr. McDonald and Mr. Utano?
Mr. Chair, Ms. O'Gorman has personally not provided me with any information, and I have never seen the statement of fact or allegations against Mr. Utano or Mr. McDonald.
So if there were emails from Ms. O'Gorman to you, including attachments with documentation regarding the statement of fact against Mr. McDonald, Mr. Utano, you would disagree with the existence of an email. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, I have no knowledge of any emails from Ms. O'Gorman
That is your
about
time,
the
Mr.
statement
Brock.
of fact or allegations.
Thank you very much. Next up, Mr. Sabera, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everyone. Welcome. and good morning to everyone. Mr. Osowski, welcome to the committee today, and thank you for availing yourself and answering the questions that have been posed. Before I begin into my line of questioning, is there anything, John, if I can just refer to you as by your first name, is there anything you'd like to add to date in terms of the question that you've answered from any of my colleagues, any clarification or anything you wish to extend on?
Thank you for the offer. I think I'm fine for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. John, in your comments to date, Mr. Osowski, you've commented that as CBSA president, you were not involved in the vendor selection process. Can you elaborate further, please?
As I say, generally speaking, as a deputy minister, I would only get involved in a contracting process if it required ministerial authority or briefing and or a Treasury Board submission, and none of those occurred in this case.
Okay. I'm a recent member of this committee, and I know there's been many questions asked on this issue. Mr. Osowski, from a professional background, how long have you been, or were you involved in terms of working in the public service?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I spent just over 32 years in the government. I worked as a deputy minister in the deputy minister ranks for 10 years, serving both the Conservative and Liberal parties.
So you have served under both administrations as a deputy minister in that role?
In the deputy minister ranks, yes.
Okay. And thank you, Mr. Osowski, and thank you for your service to the Government of Canada and obviously its citizens. In terms of, with your experience in going into when the pandemic happened, obviously it was what we call a once-in-a-lifetime event, hopefully not to be repeated anytime soon. And in terms of the challenges of ramping down and then ramping up and the staffing challenges that you saw and obviously were intricately involved in just because of the nature of what was happening, can you comment on that about the early days of the pandemic, what you were seeing?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think when you go back and you look at your emails, you see the complexity of the environment that was happening at the time. And we had to, as I mentioned, to deal with fear in our own workforce around our frontline officers and the exposure that they might had. Despite their training, there was a lot of unknowns and there was a lot of hesitancy in terms of what was coming. We were constantly readjusting our resources. We were shutting down the largest unprotected border in the world. It took a lot of effort to coordinate with our U.S. colleagues to make sure that there would be continued flow of certainly food and medicine and supplies in and out of the country. It required a great deal of cooperation from everybody involved, and it was a hands-on 24/7 environment until we faced whatever the next change that was happening. So there was remarkable flexibility on behalf of the workforce and all of my colleagues in other departments to do the best we could. There was no playbook. And in fact, I was reading in the paper today fears of avian flu and another potential pandemic, and I hope that there's a lot of lessons learned here in terms of what the future might hold for us in terms of how we would respond to a situation like that.
No, and of course, and I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves that nearly 60,000 Canadians died of COVID-19 during the pandemic, and I think it behooves us to remember that we needed the government to marshal all the resources, but via the various agencies, including CBSA, to protect Canadians, but also to protect our economy, so we could snap back out as soon as possible and ramp back up, in which we did. Mr. Osowski, there's been much mention. You hear this, I think, from folks in terms of your role in the CBSA, but then in terms of meeting with vendors, third-party suppliers. So there's an RFP which goes out at all levels of government and stuff. How would you characterize when you would meet or not meet with contractors and subcontractors, and would it be only within the work purview or outside of the work purview?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Certainly it was only ever in the work purview unless there was some sort of event that I was at that, vendors were present. But in terms of people pitching me, that happened very infrequently. In terms of me directly, usually that was handled within other parts of the organization.
Okay. No, thank you for that clarification. Mr. Osowski. Chair, how much time do I have left?
Time for one more. You're right on spot, but go ahead, please. We have a short one.
Okay. No, thank you very much. And in terms of the rollout of the ArriveCan app, and in terms of that app process, is there anything in sort of in hindsight or anything that you think we could have done differently regarding the development oversight of the application?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think, first of all, it's important to understand, and the Auditor General said it was reasonable to go and get outside help at the beginning, but this procurement vehicle that we used was the only option that was available to us. Speed was of the essence. It was the quickest way to ramp up our capacity to deliver a very simple app at the beginning to replace a piece of paper with people's basic tombstone information, biographical information. As you've heard from others, in retrospect, yes, there should have been financial coding set up right at the very beginning so that we could have tracked the expenses more carefully. But I want to remind the committee, as I said in my opening remarks, all the rules were in place. It appears, unfortunately, they were not always followed. So I make no excuses for the lack of documentation and the other things that the Auditor General found in her study. That's not acceptable. That should not have happened. And I'm sure that as we move forward, the agency's putting in measures to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est
Thank
Madame.
you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Osowski.
Suivant, puis c'est Madame.
Madame Sinclair de Gagné, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to follow on this last point. When you were the president of the CBSA, there were events that occurred that were devastating, but there were many poorly documented information papers. There was no information passed on to whoever needed to know about things in the agency. Do you think, given this type of situation, that you did a good job as head of the CBSA?
Mr. Chair, I always tried to do the best I could possibly do.
D'accord.
Okay. Now, if you were in my shoes, and if we were to change places, would you say I would be right to say that the president of the CBSA did not do her job well because of the what was in the report by the Auditor General? Would you agree?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. So obviously, as the person responsible for the day-to-day agency, responsible to the minister of the day for the running of the agency, in hindsight, yes, there are lessons learned, and if I could roll back the clock, there would have been some changes. But I remain proud of the work that I did and that my team did during the pandemic.
Passons maintenant.
Well, let's move to another subject, which is perhaps more interesting. ArriveCan demonstrates that it's really merely the tip of the iceberg in terms of the size of the problem. Mr. Osowski, given the amounts that were paid out to various businesses, that's already exploded. We're aware of that. But we do know as well that at the end of your tenure, about 20% of contracts were awarded non-competitively. Were you aware of this fact, and how was control lost at the CBSA?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I have no recollection of the percentages of contracts that were awarded competitively or non-competitively. Obviously, if something's valued under whatever the threshold is, I think it's $25,000, then it would be awarded non-competitively. So
yes, I know the rules. Your time is up.
You have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I found it interesting that you just, Mr. Osowski just said that he's proud of the work that happened around the app. And it is shocking to me that 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 would be your testimony, and I understand it was also your previous testimony in OGO. It's an app that cost millions of dollars to Canadian taxpayers, and now we're spending a lot of time trying to get to the bottom of this. So if that is your opinion, I'm just curious if, you talked about doing things differently. If you could go back, what would you change if you could restart this process?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Look, there was no choice but to develop an app. It was clear that the Public Health Agency needed a better way to collect this information. I am proud of the way the agency responded. Obviously, I'm basing it on what I knew then versus what is being revealed now. And the app was still the right answer to the challenge that we had. It facilitated our ability to manage the border, and it will continue to facilitate in its new form legitimate travel and trade across the country. And other countries are using similar approaches. So in terms of what was spent, that's the debate of the procurement system. And people are looking at that in terms of how to manage that better. But it was the only option available to us at the time to procure these outside resources to help us build the app.
So through the chair, my next question is, were you aware of the initial allegations of misconduct made by Butler AI?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I've answered, those allegations did not come to the agency, as Ms. O'Gorman has testified, until the fall of 2022, and I had already retired at that point in time.
So looking back, do you see any serious concerns with internal processes and mechanisms? Because that didn't come up. Is there something that you would do differently?
Mr. Chair, if the allegations of wrongdoing had been brought to my attention, I would have done something about it, but they were not.
You have time for one quick one, Ms. Blaney, if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Chair. So through the chair, that goes back to the question that I asked, though. It wasn't brought to your attention. What mechanisms need to change so it could be brought to the attention of this important role?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Dutt was free to email me directly, and she did not. So my officials dealt with her complaints, or Ms. O'Gorman dealt with her subsequent issue around the complaint. But Mr. Utano had testified that the first issue that he received from Ms. Dutt was around pay, and it was not about a complaint per se that needed any further investigation, and it was certainly not brought to my attention.
Thank you very much. Next up, Ms. Block, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I echo my colleagues' comments when it comes to the fact that it is absolutely mind-boggling to have the former president of the CBSA state he remains proud of the work his department undertook, when it is actually the CBSA that has served as a bellwether for the complete debacle we are studying now, known as Arrive Scam, and all of the other issues that have started to arise when it comes to procurement and contracting across all departments in the Government of Canada. I'm going to circle back to some of the questions my colleague Mr. Barrett asked, just to make sure that I heard your answers correctly, Mr. Osowski. When appearing before the Government Operations and Estimates Committee, and I'll start by restating, the umbrage you seem to have taken or are taking with the fact that individuals have accused you of lying when you came to committee. And yet when you appeared before the Government Operations and Estimates Committee, you did lie about ever meeting Christian Firth. You did not say, I do not recall, when the question was asked of you. You gave a definitive no. And we have that in the testimony. And as we know, at a subsequent meeting, you then corrected the record to say that you had, in fact, met with him. You stated that you were able to make the correction because the CBSA paid you to provide you with a document stating that you had, in fact, held this meeting. And I think most Canadians would find it strange that a former employee gets rehired as a casual employee under a temporary contract to gain access to information needed to correct the record or defend themselves when most people pay to get access to information from the Government of Canada through ATIPs. So from your earlier response, are we to understand that this is a common practice? People getting hired to gain access to information so they can defend themselves?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Let's be very clear here. When I originally answered no, I testified in December of 2022. I did so without the benefit of any support from the agency. It was based on my recollection. I answered too quickly. I should have gone to the agency afterwards and asked for them to verify my testimony. I didn't. In October of last year...
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Chair, may I finish my answer, please?
No, that is not the answer to the question
well,
I'm
getting to it, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Mr.
Chair, I did not go back to the agency as a part of a casual contract.
Ms. Block, hold on. I've stopped the clock. So, Mr. Ozowski, I know it can be frustrating. The time is for the members. There are other members who are on the will be asking questions, and I am sure they will allow you to come back to it. So I do recognize that you provided an answer. The time is now, Mrs. Block. I'm going to turn back to that. Point d'ordre? Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Monsieur le Président.
Chair, there are interpreters. When there are members speaking, two at a time, that can lead to difficulties for the interpreters.
Order as well to ensure members are not speaking over the interpreters. I know committees can clash, and so I do try to maintain order. So, Ms. Block, you have the floor again for
Thank you very much,
2 minutes and 10 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I apologize. I do expect that when a member indicates that they are receiving an answer to a question they did not ask, that the witness would respect that. My question to you, Mr. Osowski, is this: is it a common practice for individuals to get hired as casual employees under temporary contracts in order to gain access to information they need to defend themselves in front of committee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To be clear, I was not on casual employment status in October when I apologized. And yes, it is normal practice for people to be given access to the information through a casual employment. I did that, for example, for the public order inquiry. This is common practice so that people can refresh their memory and provide committees with the most accurate information for their deliberations.
Who was your contact at the CBSA to request these documents from?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't request documents. I requested access to my email. I've given a laptop so I can sign on with my credentials to access my emails and calendar.
Thank you. President O'Gorman stated you had access to all of your emails and any other information you requested. So that is in direct conflict to what you've just stated. You have testified here today that you only accessed information to confirm a meeting, and I'm assuming a calendar. Did it really take you 8 hours to review your calendar event in order to confirm your meeting with Christian Firth?
Mr. Chair, I already replied that I was not on casual employment status in October when I had that validated around the meeting, the team's meeting with Christian Firth. So that was just based on me, where I requested documents from the agency to validate that, but I was not on casual employment status at that point in time.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Up next is Ms. Khalid. Ms. Khalid, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witness for being here today. Mr. Osowski, can I just first and foremost confirm with you, did you have any interaction with any ministers while you were dealing with the ArriveCan app?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Yes, I was involved in cabinet meetings and briefings of the ministers regularly in terms of the broader aspects of how we were managing the pandemic.
And did any ministers sign off on any of the contracts that are in question today?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I don't believe the minister was ever required to sign off on any of these contracts.
And when we're talking about your involvement with these three companies, does this date to pre-COVID or pre-ArriveCan? Have you had interactions with these organizations that we're talking about today prior to COVID?